Hello guys, today me and my friends will be discussing the topic of undue influence. It's me, Gireesh, Julius, Artis and Giridharan. Let's start with the definition of undue influence.
So basically undue influence means that when two parties are entering into a contract and one person has the authority to dominate the another person, there is one person has the authority to dominate the other person to enter into a contract, and if he uses that authority by forcing that person to enter into a contract, this will amount to undue influence. So after for
So from my understanding of section 16 section 2, a person is deemed to be in a position to dominate the other, where he holds a real apparent authority over the other, or a fiduciary relation to the other, or where he makes a contract with the person whose mental capacities are affected temporarily or permanently by his reason of his age, illness, mental or bodily disorder. This is what.
So according to subsection 3 of the same section, where one person who is in a position to dominate the will of other enters into a contract with you, and it is evident that such transaction is found to be unconscionable, then it is upon the person who is in the position to dominate the will of other to prove that such contract was not induced by undue influence.
Let me add a few examples to this. For example, I am a money lender and Artis is in the need of ₹500. He comes to me and asks for the money. I tell him, okay, I'll give you the money, but there will be an interest of 100%. Because he is an urgent need, he will take the money. But he can challenge this matter into the court and ask the court to reduce the interest amount because it was the consent for this contract was given under undue influence. Another example can be a person who is suffering from a disease. His doctor or therapist asked him for a large sum of money to do for the treatment. He is under influence because he wants to get himself treated. But later he can also go to the court and ask the court to reduce the amount asked by the doctor and also ask for compensation. Brother, can you tell me some other examples of undue influence that we see in our daily life?
Some few examples can be like between master and servant, student and teachers, and parents and children, debtors and creditors, and doctors and clients, and also like gurus and devotees.
Like from what Julius has told about Guru and devotees, like in a recent case before the Allahabad High Court, it was ruled that according to this case, the Guruji asked the entire property of the client as a gift for the reason that the Guruji promised to the client that in his next life he will get a better future. So in this case, the Allahabad High Court ruled that no person with a reasonable mind would engage into such a contract, as it clearly states that if a person engages in such a contract, then the Guruji has exerted his influence upon that person. So this is a case of undue influence. Like this is an example. So in the case of undue influence, like as already discussed before, the person who is in a position to dominate the will of other must prove that he has not unduly influenced the person with whom he can dominate to enter into the contract. The circumstance that the grandfather created a gift of his property to his only grandson a few years before his death does not amount to unconsidered transaction but lost undue influence merely because the parties related to each other. Undue influence cannot be arised. Subhash Chandra Das, this is Ganga Prasad Das ownership case under the Indian Contract Act of 1872 described the concept of undue influence. To make the contract which was made out of undue influence to be enforced by law, it must be the person whose consent was taken who forcibly, it must be it is avoided the other person. If it gives consent to it, then it becomes enforceable. If it doesn't give consent to it, then it will not be enforceable by law. In this case, the plaintiff's order transfers the property out of love and affection. But the plaintiff claimed that there was undue influence. But however, the court found out that there was no case of undue influence during the transfer of the property. Hence, this case was dismissed. The court emphasizes that undue influence must be proven, especially when there is no case of a disputed relationship.
So undue influence is also said to be a subtle species of fraud, whereby master is obtained over the minds of victims, either by insiders approaches and selective artifices. And sometimes the result is also obtained through fear, coercion, or dominance, which is calculated to prevent, the victim from expressing their true minds.
So, undue influence is also said to be a supposed speech from fraud, it is obtained by insidious approaches and selective artifices. That's what they
Now we will talk about mental influence. It's a type of undue influence in which a person's mental capacity is bothered by a temporary or permanent illness that can be due to age or any underlying medical or bodily difference. Such a person, if he gives any consent to an contract, then it might be considered that he gave this under an undue influence, and hence he can avoid this contract by saying it is avoided. A similar case was happened in a High Court of Allahabad, where a widow who was in urgent need of money reached a money lender who told her he would give her the money at 100% loan interest. She was in urgent need of the money, so she accepted it, but then she challenged this matter to the court of law, where the court held that the money lender took the advantage of her distress and charged her 100% interest. At last, the court ruled and reduced the interest of the loan from 100 to 24%. However, an urgent need of money cannot be categorized under the category of undue influence. It means if there is a person who is urgent need of money, then it doesn't show that there is enough evidence that he is under mental distress. It means that if there is a person who is fighting a case in the court of law and he needs urgent money, then he contacts money lender. If money lender asks him for a large amount of money, then he cannot go to the court and say that he was in mental distress, that's why he has to take that much money. Because in that situation, the lender was in not that dominant position to ask for that much large amount of money from him. Another scenario can be if a person is facing a criminal trial and he comes in a contract with another person, the other party, to form an agreement, then he cannot go to the court again that he was forced into the contract because the contract was for his own good.
So when it comes to burden of proof, the transaction appears to be unconscionable. When the burden of proving that the contract was not induced by undue influence will lie upon the person who was in a position to dominate the will of the other. So in the case of Srimati versus Sudhakar Arbiter, the original plaintiff contested a gift deed executed by her in favor of the original defendant, alleging it was done under undue influence. However, the trial court ruled against her, finding no proof of fraud or undue influence. Upon appeal, the issue of undue influence was revisited, but the court found no evidence of supporting the plaintiff's claim. The defendant argued that he had a respectful relationship with the plaintiff, akin to mother-son bond. But there was no undue influence. The court also noted that the plaintiff had managed her property independently for many years, indicating she was capable of understanding the gift deed's implications. As a result, the court upheld the dismissal of the plaintiff's suit as she failed to prove undue influence.
So guys, finally we have come to the end of this podcast. In this podcast, we understood the concept of undue influence with some definitions and other cases that Julius and Arthur told us. With this, we are signing off. Thank you very much. Goodbye.